So, let's get on with it. I've entitled this little lecture, Some Form of Explanation of the National Budget and what it means to grades 10 and 12 in Kingswood College, Grahamstown. What does it mean to your life? And what's it all about? So let's start off with an opening perspective. Let's look at things over 100 years and look at progress over 100 years. So in April will be the centenary of the Titanic disaster. What did we do? We made a wonderful movie, okay? And now, not much has changed. We've done it all over again, okay, with the Costa this and the Costa Concordia and the Costa Palozza and all of those other things. So that doesn't help us. Also in March, it's 100 years since the Scott tragedy in the Antarctic. And there's a little thing I want to take from that, and that is that there is their grave, and they put a very simple epitaph on it, which is, "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away." And what we've got to look at with this thing is the giving and the taking, and that's what it's all about this afternoon. It's also 100 years since the ANC was formed in Bloemfontein. We've had a celebration of that. And if one looks at it and goes back to then, around about the Boer War, there were only 100 million, there were only 1 million South Africans during the Boer War. And this is how your populations changed. Some make big jokes about it. Okay, how many children does the president have and all the rest of it? Well, he doesn't have even 50. He has, in fact, 50 million South Africans that he's got to look out for. And when one looks at your population and the people that one lives with in South Africa today, you see the enormous privilege that we enjoy. And if one looks at it, let's start with, imagine all the people. It starts with 1.4 million South Africans are disabled. That's 3% of the population. There are another 2 million AIDS orphans. That's 4% of the population. Then you get 10 million child grants paid out to children who can't make it, and that is staggering 20% of the population, or 10 million, with another million who are joining the child grant system every month. Then you have 8 million children, like yourselves, whose parents can support them, but they are still dependent on somebody else. And then you add in a staggering 2.5 million old age pensioners. They've also got to be provided for, and that takes you up to about half the population, all dependent on grants. But those are the ones that are fortunate enough to receive a grant. Those that don't receive the grant are the unemployed, currently 4 million people, and then another 10 million people who just don't work for any reason whatsoever. They might have given up, they might be too old. And this group here, the 4 and the 10, are the group that are really struggling in South Africa today, and they're trying to do more for them. So, they go then to taxpayers who've got to pay for that. But the problem is we haven't got very many taxpayers, because we have about 12 million people who have a job in South Africa, but 9 million of them work below tax threshold. That is, they don't earn enough to pay tax. For example, there are 3 million domestic workers in South Africa. They don't pay tax. The fishermen, the farm workers, etc. So they're not paying in. So who does pay the tax? There are about 3.5 million South Africans who actually pay. Most of them are in the middle level. That's your day-to-day worker who doesn't get more than 500,000 Rand a year. When you say how many wealthy people are there, how many fat cats? There are only 150,000 fat cats in South Africa. And so the big problem is, no matter what you put your tax rates to in South Africa, there is always this problem. We just don't have enough wealthy people. And this tiny group up the top has got to support this enormous population. And this is the balancing act. That's what a budget is all about. You know, we always talk about tax on booze and cigarettes and everything else, but when you get to budget day, we've got to say we are blessed with now 50 million people, when we only had 1 million 100 years ago. And the priorities of a national budget are, first of all, to stop borrowing as a country. I'll come back to that in a moment. Maintaining the national deficit at an acceptable level. Then, we've got to look after all the children and the old people who've got nothing. More. We've got to try and do something for 15 million people who are above 18 but still have no future. That's why we've got to make it grow. And then we've got to keep the unions, particularly COSATU, happy that we are doing the right thing. Keeping all of those people happy first. Then we've got to build infrastructure. We've got to make South Africa a better place to be. That's what the president wants. And then we've got to give people at the lowest income level tax relief first. And after that, you've got to make it happier for the 2 million or so who actually pay tax. It's an enormous balancing act, and this is what people don't look at, is the number of people who draw from the system versus the number of people that pay into the system. Okay? So, we take all of that, and we move on, and we say, right, well, what's next? What else can you tell us about? And I don't know why this is not going further down. Just give me a moment. There we go. And we say, well, everybody starts talking about the global economic crisis. What's going on? This great big storm that's going to take over the world and wipe us all out economically. The Greece factor. Now, if you look at Greece, there are 10 million people living in Greece. They have just been given a bailout loan by the International Monetary Fund of 130 billion euro, which is about 1.3 trillion rand, to look after 10 million people. South Africa, with all our problems and only 50 million people, 5 times as many as the Greeks, are going to live on 1 trillion rand without a loan. It's quite extraordinary. Now, bring some people into it. There's Thabo Mbeki. We got to the end of Thabo Mbeki's era in the middle of 2009. JZ took over and did a very wise thing. The first move he made was to appoint Pravin Gordhan. There's your Minister of Finance. And what you get with Pravin Gordhan is he's an incredibly tough and talented person. It's not a political appointment. And he is about what's good for South Africa, not necessarily what's good for politics. And the first thing that you need with a successful Minister of Finance is an unpopular Minister of Finance. Somebody who can say no. That's incredibly important in what you're doing. Right. So Pravin Gordhan takes over, and immediately the world comes out of the economic storm of 2009. Looked a lot better. And right through 2010, that continued. But the danger that we've got at the moment is that we've fallen off a precipice. That growth has slowed down, things are much tighter, and that has some pretty severe implications for all South Africans. Now, what you see is the global credit crunch, the big recession that they spoke about in 2009, only lasted for 9 months. Then we recovered, and a year ago, it was looking pretty. So they said South Africa will grow by 3.2% per annum, and initially they were right. You immediately saw the growth rates up, but then in the middle of last year, it slowed off. And so they're having to adjust growth rate forecasts downwards. And that has a major impact, because what will the growth rate be in the future? And when one looks at predicting this, you take the Reserve Bank governor, that's Jill Marcus, okay? She says South Africa will grow at 2.8%. The head of the IMF says South Africa will grow at 2.5%. And the Minister of Finance says, well, who am I to question that? I'll make it 2.7. I'll split the difference for the next year. The big thing that he's saying is that the good economic times will only come back in 2014. We're 2 years away from that recovery actually happening and making some progress. So what he now has to do is to take these massive numbers and say, I've got to contain our borrowings. Now, if you look at red on the screen there, that's the small amount that South Africa borrows. And the magic number that they've got to do is that they've got to say that borrowing cannot be more than 5% of gross domestic product. And their future on this and what they're predicting is that they will be able to maintain that. They downgraded their forecasts a little bit in October last year, but in their latest numbers, I'm not going to take you through them, we can see that in spite of the tough times, we will not exceed the 5% of gross domestic product debt ratio. And in fact, what we'll do is we'll come down to 3 by 2014, and then even better by 2015. Why the performance? What's growth rates and deficits all about? It's a simple function that's an essential life skill that you remember it. Works like this. If your growth rate goes down, then your tax collections go down. When your tax collections go down, you spend as a government more than you borrow. That creates a deficit, pushes up your deficit. Now, that's what's been happening in Greece. They're spending far too much money on their people relative to the amount of tax that they're getting in. And as a result of that, we have these incredibly negative people called the rating agencies. And they then say, we are downgrading your country. We're saying your country is more risky. And the result of a downgrade from your rating companies is that it pushes up your interest rate, which means that everybody, including your government, who's borrowing more and more, has to pay more and more interest on their loans. So they've got less and less to spend. And that would cause an economic disaster in South Africa. That's what we've got to be so very careful of. We can't let the interest rate increase. Our interest rates in South Africa are at a record low. Borrowing, the repo rate, as we call it, is at 9% at the moment. And what we can't do is say to people now, you've got to pay more interest because they're already paying more for petrol, more for electricity, and more for everything else. So they've got to keep their interest rate down, and to do that, they've got to keep their deficit down. Now, if you look at this, this is how relative it is. Your debt to GDP ratio of your overseas countries at the moment, Greece is at 166% of its gross domestic product. Its total borrowings are more than a year's production out of Greece. South Africa sits at 37%. Now, what has happened to Greece is that they've had to make an agreement that they will reduce their numbers to 120% of gross domestic product by 2020. We are saying, as a nation, we'll stay below 50%. Now, isn't that amazing? With first world countries sitting at 120%, South Africa sitting at 50%. It's something to be very proud of as a South African at the moment. So, interest rates are going to remain low in South Africa. And South Africa cannot afford to increase its interest rates. And that's great if you're a person who's borrowing money. But if you're trying to save for your pension, your interest rates are appalling. And that's one of our second biggest problem in South Africa today is after AIDS. What are we going to do with all the old people? How are they going to actually be able to live? It's going to be incredibly difficult. So, then you come to tax collections. What happens when your economy gets into trouble is that your VAT collections, now in blue on the screen is your VAT collection, and that's from everybody going to the shops. When people haven't got money, they don't go to the shops, so the country's VAT collections go down. Now what happens when we get to the end of the year, that was the estimate which we had in October, when we got to the end of the year, they said we are going to collect 10 billion rands of VAT less than we should have. We're going to pay less income tax on persons than we should have because unfortunately we've had a problem with unemployment. We're buying less houses, but fortunately the companies can make up for it. And then you see them getting extra money from lifestyles. They get more and more money from smokes, cigarettes, electricity, and all the rest of it, and even from South Africans buying too many cars and paying more and more carbon emission taxes. So what they did was, in this year, they managed to contain it, that we were supposed to pay 742 billion rand in tax in South Africa. We were 4 billion rand short, which is neither here nor there. And what it turns out to be is that the individual taxpayer paid more or less what he should do. Companies made a little bit of extra profit, and VAT came short. So that was great, but it leaves South Africa with a problem. And our problem is that we've been collecting too much income tax from individual employed people, while companies have been paying less and less, and VAT is under stress. So what they're going to do with it is that they are now looking to turn that around and to try and get companies to pay a little bit more tax. And this has been the controversial part of the last 2 weeks, because the press have hammered this quite heavily, and there's been a lot of talk about it, etc. But let's see what the game plan is. To pay for South Africa next year, we need more tax. So we're going to get the first chunk of it from companies, firstly on their company tax, and then when they pay dividends. But now, they're going to get a little bit more from all the other taxes. Your fuel, your cigarettes, your booze, and your electricity. And then we'll get, just through inflation, you'll pay another 18 billion rand in VAT, because prices have gone up. But still, they are having to go back to the South African taxpayer. That's your parents, that's me, that's your school teacher. And say, you've got to pay another 33 billion rand in tax this year. And that's a tough, very difficult pill to swallow. What you're seeing in a picture of it is, in South Africa, the individual taxpayer steadies the ship. We pay 35% of the total taxes of the country, then we pay some more by VAT, and then we pay, the companies come in as the third biggest tax. They're trying to correct that. The other taxes are pretty small and insignificant. Right, so we continue. We say, how many people pay tax? SARS will tell you, if you look on their website, that 4 million South Africans pay tax. That's, if you've got 50 million, 1 in 11, 1 in 12 people actually pay tax. But you knock off that, the people that earn under 5,000 rands a month or 60,000 rand a year, they pay too little, earn too little to pay tax. That's the first 800,000 or so of the million, they're let off the hook completely. Then the category 60,000 to 120,000, up to 10,000 rand per month. That's 1 million people in South Africa, but they only pay 4% of the tax. The people who really pay the tax are the people above 120,000 and up to 400,000 a year. They pay 42% of the tax. And then up at the top are the fat cats. So how many people earning over 400,000 rands a year? There are only 378,000 of them. That's 9% of the taxpayers, and they are paying 54% of the tax. This enormous load that they've put on wealthy people. And they're the ones that are complaining at the moment. They say, why should we pay all of this tax? We don't get any expenditure efficiency and all of the rest of that. That's what the big issue is all about. So now what they'll do is that they play politics with it. So every year when we have the budget, we go off to Parliament and they give these extraordinary numbers about how much money they've given back to taxpayers. This year they said it would be 9.5 billion. Well, it wasn't anything like that. In fact, they're going to take 33 billion rand more from them. That was just the inflationary adjustment. So what they do is that they take their personal tax table every year and they say, we're looking to give you a better deal. So they say, at the low level, your lowest level of tax is earnings up to 160,000 a year that are taxed at 18%. And they widen that out until you get to the top rate of tax, where if you are earning more than 617,000 rands a year, you will pay 40% tax. And then they give you a discount off your bill, that's called a rebate, and they push those up every year. So what this all results in is that any South African gets 63,000 rands of tax-free income a year. Doesn't matter how old they are, until they get to the age of 65, when they push it up to 99,000, because it's been nice to pensioner season, right? And if you're over 75, they push it up to 110,000 rands a year, nearly 10,000 rand a month. Again, trying to make it easier for the lot of the pensioner. So they create this new table, which in fact is effectively pushing up tax rates above everything where it's been before. So what we've got is that tax is growing in South Africa in real terms. Your parents are paying more tax, and we've got to be careful, but it's not the only form of tax that we pay. Because another sensational aspect of this year's tax, I'm not going to go into the detail of it, is that they have changed the different taxes on the different types of business entities. So starting with companies, they've brought in dividend tax. And that pushes up the tax on the dividends that you receive by companies just a little bit. It's nothing too much to worry about that. But then they said, when you get a capital gain, and so on dividend tax, just simply take it that they've increased it a tiny amount. They haven't taken a lot of extra money from it. They've given it all to the pension funds, which is very useful. But the amount of tax that you'll actually pay on a dividend is very little. Your dividend yield on the stock markets at the moment is about 3%, and the tax goes up on that by 5%, so you can see it's going to have very little difference on your portfolio. Remember, dividend tax is not a big thing in South Africa, but capital gains tax is. And what they've done now is that they've increased where you sell your house or your shares, etc. That is a gain, unlike your salary, which is called a capital gain.